It wasn't the sound of the ambulance siren fading into the suburban drone that broke me. It was the sudden, total absence of David's rhythmic breathing next to me. A silence so monumental, it felt less like a lack of sound and more like a physical presence, a monstrous entity settling heavily on my chest. This silence was the first sign of my abandonment, the proof that the covenant I thought unbreakable, the quiet, constant assurance of divine presence in the background of a shared loving life, had been unilaterally terminated. David, my husband of 32 years, my anchor, my gentle theologian, had been taken by a swift, unforgiving heart attack at 3 a.m. The paramedics had worked, they had struggled, they had failed, and then they had packed up their glittering machines and departed, leaving me in the sterile white glare of our bedroom, which was now just a crime scene of interrupted life. I didn't cry immediately. Crying implies release, and there was no release, only compression. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the indentation where David's body had rested still slightly warm, and stared at the clock. 4:17 a.m. In the 4 minutes that followed their departure, I performed an inventory of my despair. It began not with love lost, but with faith challenged. If God was good, if God was near, how could the very source of my earthly comfort and spiritual discussion be extinguished like a faulty candle? I had always trusted in the narrative of presence. God is here. God sees. God comforts. Now the only thing I saw was the meticulous organization of David's bedside table, the worn leather-bound Bible, the half-read paperback novel, the glass of water, all perfect, all mocking the sudden, irrevocable imperfection of my life. My mind, usually a harbor of quiet reflection, became a raging, churning sea, tossing up debris of half-remembered scripture and promises that now sounded utterly hollow. I whispered into the oppressive quiet, "Where are you?" The silence that answered was vast, cold, and absolute. It wasn't the expected silence of mourning, but the terrifying silence of the infinite void, confirming every doubt I had ever suppressed, that maybe, just maybe, the foundation upon which David and I had built our lives was merely sand, and now the tide had come in and swept everything away. I stood up, the carpet soft beneath my feet, and walked towards the window. Outside, the pre-dawn sky was beginning to lighten, a pale, unforgiving gray leaking over the horizon. The world was still turning. The birds, unaware of the catastrophe inside, would begin their oblivious chorus soon. This indifference, this colossal lack of cosmic pause, was the final stinging blow. I realized that my grief was not just the pain of loss. It was the crippling paralysis of being utterly forsaken, standing naked and exposed on the shoreline while the great, uncaring ocean of existence rolled on without me. The prayer I thought I needed was a demand for explanation, a thunderous plea for intervention, but the only words that formed on my lips were dry, rasping accusations against the invisible architect of this unbearable reality, a reality that had transformed my comfortable bedroom into the loneliest place in the universe within a single fatal heartbeat. I needed to know why I had been left behind, abandoned in the wreckage of a life that felt brutally, cruelly unfinished, a statue carved out of salt, left standing alone on the precipice of a future I was certain I could not face. The weight of the world, which David had always helped me carry, now settled solely onto my shoulders, crushing the air from my lungs and the hope from my spirit, confirming the terrifying suspicion that I had been utterly forgotten by both man and divinity. The subsequent weeks dissolved into a formless gray continuum, punctuated only by the necessary mechanical motions of survival. Signing papers, answering the same whispered condolences, accepting casseroles that I would never eat. I retreated entirely into the house, a sanctuary that had instantly transformed into a mausoleum. David's absence wasn't just a missing person, it was a physical gap in the furniture of my world. The side of the bed remained untouched, the duvet pulled taut as if awaiting his return. His slippers stood guard by the door, and the faint scent of his cedar and spice cologne still clung faintly to the woolen sweater hanging over the back of his desk chair. These relics weren't comforting, they were accusations, constant reminders of the vibrant, breathing presence that had been violently excised from my reality. My spiritual life, which had been robust and comforting when shared with David, he was the one who always articulated the difficult theological concepts, the one who found the deeper meaning in parables, was now a shattered mirror. Every attempt to pray felt like shouting into a vacuum. I would kneel, hands pressed together, trying to find the path back to the familiar, benevolent God I once knew, but the connection was dead. There was only the dull echo of my own desperate voice, amplified by the emptiness of the room. This wasn't just a lack of feeling, it was a profound theological crisis. My abandonment thesis solidified. God was either unable to intervene, meaning he wasn't all-powerful, or he was unwilling to intervene, meaning he wasn't good. Both conclusions were catastrophic to the framework of my existence. I stopped reading the Bible entirely. The promises of peace and refuge felt like cheap lies, papered over the brutal truth of suffering. Friends tried to visit, offering the well-meaning, inadequate platitudes of faith. He's in a better place, or God has a plan. These phrases, which I had myself offered countless times in the past, now grated on my nerves like fingernails on slate. How could I believe in a plan that involved ripping the core warmth out of my life and leaving me shivering in the cold? I resented their certainty, their comfortable distance from the gaping void I inhabited. I began sleeping on the living room sofa, unable to bear the overwhelming dimensions of the empty master bedroom. The sofa was smaller, less demanding, offering a temporary, cramped respite from the grand scale of my loss. I would spend hours staring at the ceiling fan, watching the dust collect on the blades, meticulously tracking the slow rotation, realizing that time itself had become my enemy, stretching out endlessly into a bleak, featureless future. The outside world continued its cheerful, brutal cycle of life. Children played outside, neighbors mowed their lawns, the news reported on trivial political squabbles, and I felt like a deep-sea creature dragged onto the shore, blinded by the light and suffocating in the thin, cruel air. The sense of isolation was absolute. It wasn't just David who abandoned me. It felt as if the very divine architecture that held the universe together had dissolved, leaving me tumbling through space with no gravity, no direction, and absolutely no hope of ever finding a solid surface again. I realized I was actively waiting for something, anything to happen. A sign, a dream, a miracle. But the heavens remained utterly, chillingly silent, solidifying the terrifying reality that in this moment of my greatest need, I was utterly, irrevocably alone. Driven by a momentary, perverse impulse, I finally forced myself into David's study, a room I had studiously avoided for 6 weeks. This space was David's sanctum, smelling perpetually of aged paper, pipe tobacco, though he'd quit years ago. The scent lingered in the leather, and the subtle sharpness of cedar. It was a repository of his intellect and his faith. I had hoped to find a letter, a secret message, anything that would explain the abruptness of his departure or provide a final spiritual instruction. Instead, the room presented itself as a meticulous archive of a life now categorized as finished. The oak desk was precisely as he had left it, organized stacks of research notes, his favorite fountain pen resting on a blotter, waiting. The sheer, overwhelming order of the room was devastating. His intellectual pursuits, his deep love for biblical history, his commentary on the minor prophets, all these things lay inert, pointless. I ran my hand over the spine of a massive leather-bound volume of Calvin's Institutes, a book he used to read aloud to me on quiet Sunday afternoons. Now it was just weight, ink, and paper. I wasn't looking for solace in his theology. I was looking for a flaw, a contradiction, something that would allow me to dismantle the foundation of faith that had failed us both. I pulled books randomly from the shelves, letting them fall open to reveal dusty, meaningless paragraphs. I was searching for the crack in the cosmic armor, the error in the divine calculation that had led to this outcome. Hours bled into one another. The afternoon sun, usually filtered warmly through the study's heavy curtains, cast long, accusatory shadows. I began to weep finally, a dry, choked sound, not tears of sorrow, but tears of pure, impotent rage, directed at the silent rows of books that purported to hold the answers to everything, yet offered nothing to my current agony. My hand settled on a shelf dedicated to obscure ancient history and early Christian apocrypha, texts David sometimes consulted for context, but rarely read for devotion. Tucked between a history of the Byzantine Empire and a treatise on Gnosticism was a slim, unassuming book, its linen cover faded to an indeterminate beige. It was a collection of prayers and spiritual meditations from the Desert Fathers, printed in a small, almost microscopic font, likely purchased during a graduate seminar trip decades ago. I had never seen him touch it. As I lifted it, I felt a slight displacement, an almost imperceptible shift in weight at the back of the shelf. There was a small, dusty gap, and behind it, a journal. Not David's meticulous theological journals, but a small, plain, spiral-bound notebook, the kind used for grocery lists or quick meeting notes. It was entirely out of place in his scholarly organization. My heart, dormant for weeks, gave a painful, hesitant beat. Perhaps this was it, the key, the explanation. I opened the journal, the paper brittle and yellowed, anticipating a final message of love or a profound instruction on how to live without him. But the journal was nearly empty. Only 3 pages were written on, dated over 15 years ago, during a period when David had faced a serious, though ultimately non-fatal, business crisis that had tested his mental endurance. The handwriting was rapid, almost frantic, a stark contrast to his usual calm script. This wasn't a message for me. It was David's own record of spiritual battle, a testament to a time when he too had felt the biting cold of perceived divine abandonment. The pages detailed his fear, his anger, and finally his desperate search for a prayer that didn't demand change, but accepted the terrifying reality of stasis. It was a private map of his own journey through the void, a silent confirmation that even David, my steady rock of faith, had once wrestled with the feeling of God's cold distance.
The entries in the small, unassuming journal detailed David's own terrifying descent into spiritual despair during that financial crisis long ago. He wrote about the hypocrisy of maintaining a facade of faith while internally screaming at the heavens. He described waking up every morning with a paralyzing dread, convinced that the foundation of their future was crumbling and that God was either testing him beyond endurance or had simply packed up and left the jurisdiction entirely. The most revealing section was his struggle with prayer. He wrote, "Every prayer I offer is a disguised demand. I demand salvation from debt. I demand peace of mind. I demand a sign that I am not alone. And when the silence meets my demands, the abandonment cuts deeper." I realized my faith was contingent on comfortable outcomes. If the outcome is despair, where is my faith then? He continued, tracing out a specific pivotal moment of realization where he stopped pleading for external comfort and began searching for a prayer of absolute resignation combined with radical acceptance. This wasn't about finding joy in suffering, but about finding truth in the feeling of being utterly forsaken. The critical text was tucked deep on the third page, scribbled rapidly in the margin, almost an afterthought. When the spirit is absent, the frame remains. I sought a shelter, but was given the desert. Let the prayer be, though the heat of the desert is upon me, and your shadow is nowhere found, let me acknowledge the dust from which you forged me, and let my barrenness testify to the vastness of the space only you can fill. I do not demand the water, I accept the sand. Only ensure that even in this sand, I still stand upon ground that is fundamentally yours. This wasn't a conventional prayer. It was a surrender to the landscape of desolation itself, a fierce refusal to deny the pain while simultaneously refusing to deny the ultimate ownership of the divine, even over the pain. The words resonated with a jarring truthfulness that transcended the sugary comfort offered by standard religious fare. David had found a way to pray from a place of radical honesty, acknowledging the absence without rejecting the source. For me, reading this, it felt like staring into a mirror reflecting a shared struggle, even across the chasm of death. It didn't solve my current problem. David was still gone. But it offered a methodology for enduring the unsolved. I traced the words with my finger, feeling the imprint of his desperation and his eventual quiet victory. He hadn't asked for the storm to stop. He had prayed for the strength to stand in the eye of the storm, knowing that the earth beneath him, however tempest-tossed, was still the earth. This realization was massive. All my prayers had been demands for restoration. Restore David, restore comfort, restore my certainty. David's prayer was a demand for radical truth. Acknowledge the desolation, acknowledge the terrifying stillness, and stand there anyway. I carried the journal back to the living room sofa, the small book feeling impossibly heavy, with the weight of this shared human failing. I realized that my crisis of abandonment was not unique. It was the essential crisis of faith experienced by anyone who has ever truly felt God's absence.
The question wasn't whether God abandoned us, but whether we abandoned the possibility of God being present in the very act of feeling abandoned. The words of David's marginalia became a haunting refrain, challenging my deeply held assumption that faith must always feel warm and reassuring. The study's sudden revelation, this quiet testament to David's own spiritual trial, had begun the slow, agonizing process of rewiring my perception of the divine presence. The marginalia, that fierce, private prayer David had penned years ago, became my focus, challenging every comfortable notion of faith I had relied upon. I spent the next few days dissecting it, not with intellectual curiosity, but with the raw, visceral need of a drowning person clutching a piece of driftwood. The phrase, "I do not demand the water, I accept the sand," was particularly brutal. It demanded that I stop fighting the desolation. My heart screamed that acceptance was capitulation, that if I stopped fighting the abandonment, I would disappear entirely into the grief. But David's earlier words, "When the spirit is absent, the frame remains," suggested a quiet resilience, a recognition that the structural integrity of the human spirit, forged in the image of the divine, persists even when the subjective sensation of comfort vanishes. This led me to a central, agonizing dilemma that I knew many who felt forsaken must face. We confuse the feeling of God's presence with the fact of God's presence. When the feeling, the warmth, the certainty, the clear direction is gone, we immediately conclude that the fact is also untrue. But what if the greatest act of faith is holding fast to the structural certainty of a loving God, even when every single internal alarm is screaming that He has vanished? This thought, this immense shift from subjective experience to objective reality, felt like a theological earthquake. It was during this reflection, sitting alone in the quiet afternoon light, the weight of the empty house pressing in, that I felt a profound need to reach out, not for comfort, but for shared perspective. If I was wrestling with this, surely others who have experienced profound loss, loss of a child, loss of health, loss of marriage, have faced the exact same terrifying question. The silence of abandonment is universal, cutting across all creeds and experiences. If we can only talk about faith in terms of perpetual peace and comfort, we do a disservice to the vast human experience of suffering. The real conversation starts when the peace runs out. We often believe faith means feeling comforted. But what if faith is holding fast when all feeling is gone, standing on the truth when the truth feels like a lie? If you've ever faced a loss so deep it made you question everything you thought you knew about comfort, I want to ask you, viewer, not for an easy answer, but for honesty. When the silence was loudest, when the emptiness was absolute, what lie did you tell yourself just to survive the night? Did you tell yourself this pain was temporary? That David was only resting? That you would wake up and everything would be normal? Or did you tell yourself that you deserved this loss? Share your experience below. Sometimes just naming the lie is the first step toward truth. Sometimes the articulation of that deep, hidden struggle is the only way to realize that your ground, however shaky, is still shared ground. My lie, I realized, was that David's physical presence was the only tether I had to the divine. His journal was forcing me to confront the frightening possibility that the tether was internal all along, woven into the very fabric of my being, independent of his breath or his hand in mine. This realization was deeply painful because it meant I had been handing over my spiritual power to an external source for decades, and now I had to reclaim it in the midst of complete, devastating wreckage. The confrontation with my own spiritual dependency was immediate and brutal. I tried to reject the insights from David's journal. I argued fiercely with the phantom of David sitting across the room, railing against the philosophical tidiness of his acceptance. "It's easy for you to write about accepting the desert, David," I whispered into the air, my voice hoarse from disuse. "You wrote this when you were alive, when you had the strength to fight the crisis, knowing you had a comfortable home and a loving wife to return to. You had the future. I have nothing but the suffocating reality of your absence. This isn't a crisis of business. This is an ultimate abandonment." The despair intensified, fueled by the feeling that even David's profound realization was now useless to me, a mere intellectual exercise that offered no balm for the visceral ache of separation. I entered the deepest valley of my mourning, a point where the emotional pain manifested physically. I became intensely cold, even wrapped in heavy blankets. My joints ached, my head pounded with a relentless, dull throb, and the simplest tasks, drinking a glass of water, walking from the sofa to the kitchen, felt like Herculean labors. This was the anatomy of absolute despair, the complete failure of the body and mind to find any reason to continue functioning efficiently. I stopped grooming myself. I stopped answering the door. The outside world faded entirely, leaving me in a small, dark orbit of self-pity and rejection. I lay curled on the sofa, clutching David's journal, the small book now damp from the tears that finally found their way out. I was rejecting the sand David spoke of. I was still thrashing wildly, demanding the water, demanding that God reverse time, undo the heart attack, restore the comfort, or at least send a dramatic, undeniable flash of light to prove he cared. This lowest point felt like a final, terminal stripping away. The house, usually so full of the echoes of our shared life, seemed to participate in my decay, growing colder, dimmer, heavier. I saw myself, truthfully, as a small, insignificant speck of dust, utterly powerless against the immensity of death and the terrifying indifference of the cosmos. In the depths of this darkness, I realized that true abandonment wasn't God leaving me. It was the realization that I had entirely lost the spiritual capacity to perceive His presence through my pain. I was so fixated on the form of comfort I expected, David's hand, God's loud voice, that I was completely blind to any other manifestation. The weight of this self-imposed spiritual blindness was heavier than the grief itself. I was trapped in a cage of my own making, reinforced by expectation and resentment. This absolute low point was the turning point. When every fiber of my being wanted to curse God and die, when I felt the total void of my existence, something shifted. It wasn't a voice or a light, but a simple, profound exhaustion with the fighting. I was too tired to demand, too tired to rage, too tired even to weep. In that space of total depletion, I remembered David's note, "I do not demand the water, I accept the sand." I was finally ready to accept the desert, not as a punishment, but as the raw, terrifying reality of my present existence. The act of surrender began not with faith restored, but with utter, exhausted resignation. The moment of utterance arrived not with fanfare, but with the dry, rasping sound of a long-neglected voice. I was too weak to kneel, so I sat upright on the sofa, the journal resting open on my lap, its fragile pages illuminated by the gray light of a late afternoon. I was not praying out of belief, nor even out of hope, but out of a desperate, final exhaustion. I was done fighting the universe, David, and God. I closed my eyes and focused only on the words David had painstakingly recorded, letting their resonance fill the internal vacuum. I didn't try to infuse them with emotion. I merely tried to articulate the truth they contained. The specific prayer I finally spoke derived directly from the core realization in David's marginalia was this: Sovereign Lord, the heat of the desert is upon me, and the comforting shadow of your presence is nowhere found. I have searched the horizons, I have screamed into the void, and I have found only the burning stillness of my own grief. I confess that I feel utterly abandoned and betrayed. I do not demand the restoration of what was lost. I do not demand the immediate end of this pain. I accept the sand of this barren reality. Let my present painful barrenness testify not to your absence, but to the immensity of the space only you can fill, and the depth of the love you once allowed me to hold. Though I cannot perceive the structure of your hand, let me acknowledge the dust from which you forged me, and let my standing here, alone and broken, be the proof that even in this deepest void, I still stand upon ground that is fundamentally yours. If comfort is denied, let truth be revealed. If peace is delayed, let resilience be gifted. I stand in the sand. I stand in the truth. Testing this newfound, fragile equilibrium required deliberate practice. The prayer itself became my spiritual breathing exercise, a mantra of acceptance, repeated silently whenever the waves of despair threatened to overwhelm the quiet resolve. I began to approach the memories of David not as crippling losses, but as chapters of a cherished book I could read without demanding a different ending. My first tentative step back into the world was simple: tending to the rose bushes in the backyard that David had cultivated so lovingly. They were overgrown, scraggly, and desperately thirsty, mirroring the state of my own soul. Pulling on the gardening gloves, feeling the rough texture of the earth beneath my fingers, and smelling the sharp, loamy scent of the soil was a grounding experience. It was physical, immediate, and demanding of present attention. As I pruned the dead wood and watered the thirsty roots, I contemplated the parallel to my own spiritual life. I had to prune the dead, demanding expectations, the expectation of comfort, the expectation of explanation, the expectation that life should be fair, before the new growth of acceptance could take root. It was hard work. The thorns scratched my arms. The effort made me sweat, and the bending and kneeling stretched muscles that had been dormant for too long. But with every dead branch I clipped, I felt a slight release of the spiritual tension that had gripped me. This was the resilient autonomy gifted by the prayer, the ability to work, to create, to mend the small corners of the world that were still accessible to me. I wasn't fixing the catastrophic loss, but I was fixing the neglected garden, and in that small act, I found a measure of redemptive purpose. I realized that the healing was not in the dramatic miracle, but in the steady, quiet commitment to the mundane acts of living. The prayer had not offered instant joy, but instant resilience. When I finished, dirt caked beneath my nails and my body pleasantly tired, I looked at the rejuvenated rose bushes. They hadn't blossomed yet, but the potential was there, patiently waiting for the necessary nourishment. I sat on the small stone bench David had built, and instead of weeping over his memory, I spoke to him softly, not asking for him to return, but sharing the quiet satisfaction of the completed task. The sense of constant divine observation was no longer an oppressive surveillance, but a gentle, supporting presence, a recognition that even in the dust and the sweat, the act of tending life was itself a profound act of faith. I understood then that David's spiritual legacy was not merely the comfort he provided in life, but the tools he unknowingly left behind, that forgotten journal, that raw, honest prayer, tools that allowed me to rebuild the foundation of my own faith when the scaffolding of our shared life had collapsed. The experience of abandonment was transforming into the experience of profound, solitary strength, a strength I never knew I possessed, born from the refusal to deny the pain while simultaneously refusing to deny the unwavering reality of the ground beneath my feet. My return to the external world was slow and intentional. The first call I made was not to a friend, but to a neighbor, offering to help coordinate a community food drive, a small gesture that forced me out of my self-absorption and into the necessary rhythm of human interaction. The key difference was the motivation. Before, I would have participated out of duty or the need for distraction. Now I participated from a place of quiet strength, a desire to anchor myself in the needs of others, recognizing that my grief, however immense, did not grant me a unique exemption from human responsibility. I found that interacting with others did not diminish my sorrow, but it contextualized it. The world was full of pain, loss, and hidden struggles, and my own desert was just one landscape among many. This recognition fostered a deep, unexpected empathy, a byproduct of having walked through the terrifying silence of abandonment. I began to understand David's prayer more deeply. Accepting the sand was not just passive endurance. It was recognizing that the sand was the fundamental material of the universe, and we are all built from it, sharing its gritty, difficult composition. The simple acts of communication, of listening to a neighbor discuss their struggles with a difficult child or a small financial worry, grounded me further in the present moment, pulling me away from the overwhelming gravity of the past. I also returned to the scriptures, but with a profoundly different approach. I no longer searched for easy promises of prosperity or immediate comfort. Instead, I sought out the Psalms of desolation, the cries of lament, the experiences of Job and the prophets who truly felt the terrifying weight of God's silence. David's journal had taught me that true faith lies in the willingness to articulate the deepest pain and accusation without severing the connection entirely. I found immense comfort not in the Psalms of joy, but in those raw, honest interrogations of the divine, such as Psalm 88, where the author speaks of being overwhelmed by darkness and forgotten by God, yet still addresses the lament to God. This was David's prayer writ large, standing in the deepest part of the desert, but acknowledging that the desert belongs to the one who created it. My understanding of the divine presence matured from a comfortable domestic assumption to a vast cosmic certainty that endures even when veiled by suffering. David was gone, but the scaffolding of his faith, the quiet resilience he demonstrated in his own time of crisis, had become the blueprint for my own endurance. I was building a new life, brick by agonizing brick, not replacing the old one, but constructing a parallel structure sturdy enough to withstand the winds of absolute loss. The prayer became my foundation, not a shield against the pain, but the very ground on which I chose to stand and face the undeniable reality of a life profoundly altered, but not irrevocably ruined. The strength I felt was not an illusion. It was the quiet, undeniable strength of surrender to truth, the most powerful force against the chaos of despair, transforming my feeling of being forgotten into the solid certainty of being held, however invisibly, within the immutable framework of creation itself. This transformation was the true miracle, quiet and internal, accessible not through demand, but through acceptance.